I'm really curious to know, Joseph, your thoughts on what indigenous reciprocity initiatives could look like in the psychedelic sector with such a diversity of companies, services, apps, gummies. I mean, you name it. Like, just it's not just facilitators. It's so many, it's so many, products that are being developed now. Should they even care? Should a mushroom gummy company even care about indigenous reciprocity?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is going to be yes. I think no matter what you do, you should care about reciprocity, and I definitely agree with Sutton, and I know that Shanae is going to share as well. But the sort of idea that there's anyone that's removed from this relationship is just obviously not true, and I think it doesn't matter if you're working with a medicine that comes directly from a whole plant that comes from an indigenous tradition, or if you're working with synthetic psychedelics, or if you're working in biomedicine and you're not using any plant medicines. There's still a continuity, and there's also a relationship. But I work with, in Erie, we work with over 30 different indigenous groups from diverse communities in 7 countries across the Americas. And so they're all connected to this explosion, as you put it, in the global north of companies and this industry in different ways. But the economic system, the cultural system that this movement is coming out of, that the psychedelic science institution is operating within, is the same hegemonic dominant system that is also in South America, in Central America, in indigenous communities around the world. And they're really, like, my understanding of reciprocity is that it's something that happens between beings, between subjects who recognize each other as people with agency, as personhood. And that also includes the land as a person with whom we're in relationship, and we need to be honoring that relationship. But I don't really believe that the system, the structures that we're talking about here, can have reciprocity. There's no because it doesn't recognize the land as a person, and it doesn't recognize the communities that provide our labor and our resources as, as persons who should be valued and compensated. And so my strategy, the way that I work with the communities that I partner with, is really just supporting their efforts to build autonomy as communities, because I can't change the structure and the system, but what I can do is support grassroots movements to build power in the community, because that is the only way that you can leverage any pressure on the system and on the structures. And so, what Shanae talked about, being able to govern herself with her community, allows them to dictate terms to the external actors, to people that want to build a business relationship, who want to extract or exploit or whatever. The only thing that stops those people is when there's a community that's united, that has sovereignty, that has solidarity, that has a coalition. And all of the communities I work with, so in Ecuador, I work with Kofan and Quechua community associations. They were able to achieve something last year with the banning of drilling in Yasuni National Park. The only reason they could do that is because they have these community organizations that build power, that have been fighting for their land and fighting for more control over their territories and their resources. So backstage, we mentioned the Indigenous Ayahuasca Conference, and one of my teachers that participates in that conference said that when you talk to Indigenous leaders, they're not interested in talking about psychedelics. They're interested in having their territorial rights and their human rights respected. And that's really where we have to start. And I don't think that the psychedelic community is going to be able to get to these sort of like lofty goals of healing humanity without confronting what's going on the ground and in the community, at the community level. And reciprocity is something that happens interrelationally, between each other. And we can do that on an individual level, but I think we have to get to the community level and understand what we can do as individuals is limited. And so my goal, and I think like the hope that I have, is just that if we can support each other as communities and build more solidarity and more power, more sovereignty in that at that level, then we can exert pressure on the system and the structure that is still perpetuating colonial logic and colonial practices in the way that medicines, not just medicines, but also ecologies, knowledge and practices are being exploited and extracted from. And just recognizing really that we only exist because of the gifts of other beings, and that includes the food that we eat. It's a gift. And so what's the natural intuitive response to a gift is gratitude. But how do you express gratitude? That's through reciprocity. And so that question is going to be slightly different for everybody, but it's going to have to come back to that basic principle.
Stemming from that conversation, I want to go deeper into like the continued colonialism, right? So, colonialism really emerged out of like Western imperialism and, that whole history of conquest. And so Western culture and capitalism tends to see natural resources as commodities. And so the medicalization of psychoactive plants and fungi is also a commodification of sacred ancestral medicines. I'm curious to know your perspective, Shanae, on how this impacts Indigenous peoples.
Great question. Well, it all goes back to before Westernization and globalization and imperialism even existed. Right. And so, there are creation stories of all of the various plants. When tribes and communities use particular plants, medicines for food, scrapes, pregnancy, moods, all of the different mood-based effect plants, all the different medicine plants, our whole ideology and approach is drastically different from Western globalization. So right in there already, globalization, colonization, it starts with the erasure of any of that kind of thought, period. Even just beginning to think like that is erased the moment you begin to approach the plant from a whole different, from a commodity standpoint. So that impacts us various ways. We can just talk about the health disparities in the community. Number one health disparity in Indigenous communities is mental health. Because you can be physically healthy, you can be physically fit, you can be, financially healthy. Your financial account, status can be extremely healthy, but your mental health, what we deal with is insidious trauma, historical trauma, generational trauma, and present day trauma. So if we have investors that come into our community with a $20 million opportunity, we're already in a very poor health state to begin with. And they're looking to come in and turn our ideologies of the creation story of how cannabis may have gotten to a community, or how psilocybin may have gotten to a community, or even just sassafras. We just start there, has gotten to a community. And they see the ability to profit off of the amount and the abundance that a tribe has by throwing $20 million to it. Well, now we're sort of entrapped because we want to get out of the financial place that we're in, but you have different people at different levels. So the impact is extremely severe and it's extremely hard to get out of. But I think what could benefit the spaces that are essentially becoming the industrial leaders of medicine, what could benefit them is to really understand the point of origin of all of it. Because when we think about specifically plants, growing them outside, you have to think about the soil content. You have to think about all of the invasive pests that are, taking over the trees, taking over the plants, and understanding why is this happening? Why is, climate change, this crisis at the rate as it is? Because of the erasure, again, of the belief system that indigenous people have had. If you're living a biocentric lifestyle, there is a time to plant, there's a time not to plant. There's a time to fish, there's a time when not to fish. There is a time to go indoors, have ceremony, there's a time not to. There's a time to wake up, there's a time to go to sleep. There's a time to mate, there's a time to marry, there's a time not to. All of these particular belief systems that are ingrained in the governance structure of the tribes, because it's in the governance structure. You have chiefdoms, you have societies, you have different roles, all of those kind of things. It's beyond just a plant, Unfortunately, I feel like the plants sort of take the most abuse, which is why we go so hard in advocating for freeing these plants, right? But we have the ability to speak. That's a part of our creation story. And our job is to protect and have reciprocity with those plants. But if even that belief system is not what the colonial system agrees with, they find a way to make it they find a way to make it illegal to even think those thoughts, to even begin to move towards that kind of way of living. They criminalize people that move towards those kinds of ways of living. They do that through what's today is green colonialism by, extracting more land, deforesting a particular area, over harvesting certain plant medicines. All of those kind of things are completely different from the governance structure from whichever community is in a particular area. So the impact is extremely severe because you have to be very, very, very spiritually strong, because your health can, decline because you don't have the necessarily resources in an overall community. Your mental health is already, kind of like I mentioned, the different tiers of layers of trauma that you experience, but as a collective, it impacts. So you think of household, you think of clans, you think of tribes, then you think of nations, then you think of bands. And this is something that you can see all throughout what we call Turtle Island begin to really, really develop. And so there's almost a need to survive in this society through monetary benefits. And so there are people that somewhat leave that belief system, unfortunately, within a tribal community to seek a way to gain monetary resources to bring back to the community, but they have to compromise their spirituality. And that is something that we do see, and that's probably one of the other largest impacts in our community. But it starts within our governance system.
Yeah, I think another, obvious example too is, just the over exploitation of some of these sacred medicines, like, the over exploitation of iboga for ibogaine therapy, and how that actually has a very real impact on, potentially depriving these communities of their sacred medicines for their own ceremonies and healing practices, because the plants are getting poached for predominantly consumption in the West. So there's so many multifaceted aspects of how this type of commercialization can really impact the indigenous.